Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. We're starting a series called Talking Story, Conversations with Sisters and Brothers in Communities of Color. And of course, Talking Story is a Hawaiian term. That's what we do. We sit around and we chat, we talk stories, we get to know each other, and most importantly, we are able to connect with each other, relate to each other, and learn about each other's stories, learn about each other's culture and backgrounds. And so throughout this series, we're going to be conversing with members of the communities of color and getting to know them, getting to know their stories, but more importantly, to learn more about why they're so passionate about justice concerns and justice issues. And so my guest today is Dr. Russell Jeung. He is the chair and professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State. And he's also the founder of Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center. He's the author of several books, two of which are At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors, and Faithful Generations, Race and New Asian American Churches. I'm so happy that Dr. Jeung is with us today, and we had coffee some years ago, and I was hoping that we'd be able to get him to the church, and now is the time. This is such a great and appropriate time. So thanks for joining us, Russell.
Thanks for having me, Pastor Gerald. Nice to talk to LOPC people.
Great. So, these have really been very intense and very tough months, the past few months. And so I wanted to begin by asking you, how are you doing in your heart, mind, and spirit?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So we've just are getting out of the wildfire and the poor air quality, and we're still sheltered in place. So I'm grateful for blue skies this morning. But this week also we've seen the passing of Supreme Court Justice Bader Ginsburg. We saw the verdict of the killers of Breonna Taylor. For Asian Americans, we saw Republicans vote to not denounce anti-Asian hate. So they voted not to support the Asian American community. And so they're troubling times for me. The polarization of the country, the continued issues of race and pandemic, global warming, and the economy really burden me. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah. Seems like it never stops. There's one thing after the other.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know that our listening audience would love to get to know you. And so would you share a little bit about yourself and what led you into the path of teaching Asian American studies, but also about your deep and abiding interest in justice and equality and equity?
So the question about why, especially as a person of faith, as a Christian, that I'm so passionate about pursuing justice, and justice in terms of what I think are God's right relations or righteous relations, I think actually stem from me reading the Bible. And if you read the Bible, and I grew up in a church that really valued the authority of Scripture, really taught that we should interpret and really obey Scripture. And so I read all these passages about God's kingdom, how we're supposed to seek first his righteousness and his kingdom, how we're supposed to pursue justice. So much of the Old Testament deals with seeking justice in Israel, and Jesus himself sought to serve the least among us. And so for me, growing up in a Chinese church and being taught to really follow scriptures, and then reading in scriptures how much Jesus said, blessed are the poor, how much we should serve the least of these, I just really wanted to do what the Bible taught us to do, and to seek God's kingdom first. At the same time, I grew up in a middle class environment. It was a really upwardly mobile church. They're working class Chinese, but they were very upwardly mobile. So for me, that was a contradiction. It's like, our church also told us not to love the world, not to pursue the world's riches, not to pursue worldly passions or interests. But it seemed to me, my church, they preach scriptures to follow it literally, to not love the world and to seek God's righteousness. But at the same time, I saw a lot of people being upwardly mobile and not, and being sort of sometimes trapped by that middle class upward mobility that they were pursuing, that they seemed like they were trying to love both God and money. And so for me, that was a contradiction. And when Jesus said to the rich young ruler, sell everything and follow me, for me, that was actually an invitation, because I got into a really good school and I thought, wow, the world's my oyster. I have a lot of opportunity, but Jesus inviting me to give that up, to follow him, seemed like a different type of invitation, not to pursue the world's opportunities, but to pursue God's kingdom. And I wanted to follow God, or God led me to follow him, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When I became, go ahead.
I think the second thing that really led me to pursue God's justice besides scriptures was just growing up in San Francisco. I saw a lot of poverty, and I worked in Chinatown with other immigrant working class individuals and saw how hard they struggled and worked so hard, yet were stuck in poverty. We would go to the Tenderloin in San Francisco, and I would see unhoused people sleeping on the streets. And for me, it just seemed so wrong. And maybe now we're so used to seeing homeless, or we're so used to having people in restaurants not making living wages. But when I was young, I thought, that is so unjust. That is so not God's way, that I wanted to do something about it. And so seeing the struggles of people, seeing the contradictions in American life, what America promised to be a land of equal opportunity and a democracy, but seeing how people were locked out of a lot of America's opportunities, those contradictions plus scriptures really led me to think a lot about what's right in this world and what God's calling us to do.
It's interesting, because when I became a Christian, I started attending a church in Honolulu. And what I appreciated, but when I look back at it now, might have been a little bit of not enough emphasis on other things. So by that I mean personal salvation is what they emphasize. And I don't remember really hearing from the pulpit or in Sunday school classes anything about, we did talk about the rich young ruler and giving up his wealth, but I don't recall ever getting a sense that we were also to be personally involved and engaged in social justice issues. And I feel a little embarrassed about that. The emphasis was so much on just personal salvation. Did that?
Yeah, my church was like that too. They really emphasized personal salvation and evangelizing other people to receive Jesus. And I believe in that. But I also believe that personal salvation means caring for the poor, transforming my own heart to be more generous, to be more loving, to be more justice seeking. And so for me, personal salvation entails giving up everything to follow Jesus and just loving the least of these.
Thank you. I had mentioned at the beginning of our interview that Dr. Jeung has written a book called At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors. And a friend of mine actually recommended this book to me. And so I read it some years ago. And when I read it, I was so moved and so inspired by it. And that's the reason I reached out and contacted Dr. Jeung, and we had coffee. And the story and the book is so inspiring to me. And I would love for you to share the heart of this book and why it was so important for you to move into East Oakland and also to begin a church, to found a church there, and especially to work with refugee and immigrant communities. So could you tell us a little bit about the book and why it mattered to you to write this?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, growing up, I was taught to really follow scriptures closely, to seek to lead a holy life, one of worship and personal devotion to God. So we would have prayer times, Bible studies, attending fellowship to support one another. And so I was doing all the right things in my church world, but I still longed for a closer relationship with Jesus, a more intimate one with him. And I was doing all the things that my church told me you were supposed to do to develop that close relationship with Jesus: prayer, Bible study, fellowship. But there's still, a longing for more depth, for more meeting Jesus in real ways. And so, again, I read scriptures and it said, "Blessed are the poor," and that always sort of puzzled me, because why are the poor blessed? What makes them so special? Jesus said, "You'll meet me when you serve the least of these." And again, he told the rich young ruler, "If you give everything to me and follow me, then you'll receive the gifts of the kingdom." So I thought, well, if there's so much Jesus was saying about giving up everything to follow him, I thought I would try it. I wasn't fully going to give up all my wealth. I wasn't going to fully give up my career, but I thought for a summer, I would spend a summer among the poor, living in a low-income neighborhood with refugees and undocumented people, and just see, why are the poor blessed? Will I see Jesus when I serve the least of these? Will all these things be added to me when I seek first God's kingdom? And so I spent a summer at a place called Oak Park Apartments, where a lot of Cambodians and Latino immigrants lived. And even though that neighborhood is called the Murder Dubs, and because it was so crime-ridden, even though it was so impoverished that you would see people would dump everywhere, so it'd be really and graffitied and litter strewn, even though there were cockroaches and mouse infestations, even though right outside my door there was constant crack drug dealing, I met Jesus in deeper and more meaningful ways than I had before. And I loved it there because the people welcomed me so much, that I really did meet Jesus in the people who welcomed me so much, that he, I was actually the stranger who needed hospitality. I was the hungry person who needed feeding. I was the naked person who needed clothing when I went to Oak Park, and my neighbors, and Jesus through my neighbors, met me there. They were so welcoming, so embracing, so supportive of me, and I could tell stories about it, that I felt like, wow, I found a pearl of great price. I found a treasure in the field that I was be willing to give up everything for. And so I did not only stay for 3 months, I ended up staying in that apartment complex for a decade. I met my wife and brought her there, because it's, when you find a treasure of great price, you want to share it. And then I've been living in this neighborhood for the last 30 years, raising my family here, because again, I think we're meeting Jesus and following Jesus and having scriptures come alive to us in ways that I hadn't known in my middle class previous life. So I guess, yeah, it's meeting Jesus in new ways, because I have passion for justice, because I wanted to meet him among the poor, that I was able to do so.
The story about how the building became so run down because of the inattentiveness of the landlord led to you and the residents there to a lawsuit, and eventually the apartments changed, and so did the dynamics of the neighborhood in that complex change. Could you tell us more about that story and what happened? You had mentioned how a sense of community was lost, even though things improved.
Yeah. Okay, so let me first tell you that sense of community and that sense of connectedness that I received, that led me to pursue a lawsuit with my neighbors. Just to give you a taste of the treasure of heaven that I got. So what happened to me was I had my computer stolen by the drug dealers, and we knew it was the drug dealers who were, again, right outside my window, because everybody in the complex knew. And so it was really frustrating for me because I was doing research as a grad student. All my work was in that computer, and so it was really frustrating. What was more frustrating was that I would see the kids, they were drug runners every day. And so, you know how David talked about how he was surrounded by his enemies? And for me, I would go into the complex and I would see these drug dealers and drug runners, and I would glare at them and they would glare at me, and I knew they stole something from me, and they were, sort of, proud and, about looking at me and saying, we've got your stuff. So it was really, stressful to be surrounded by people who don't like you, who are taking your stuff and are gloating about it. So word on the street was that I could get my computer back. And it was sort of cool because, how many times do you get word on the street in Lafayette if you ever go out into the streets, right? How often?
The main streets of Lafayette.
Yeah. So word on the street was I could get my computer back. I thought, oh, that's like, something from the Holy Spirit. So I was so excited. I called the police and said, hey, word on the street is I could buy, my computer was stolen, I could buy it back. And they said, great. We never get people calling, reporting crimes in Oakland because nobody really trusts the police. And they said, we'll wire you. And then when you make the deal, we'll arrest people. I go, wow, this is so fun, right? It's like being on CSI. So I said, great. So they told me to make a deal and then they'll wire me and we'll do the arrest. And so the word on the street was if I spoke to Roach was a guy who lived with George, this convicted manslaughter, but Roach knew how I could get my computer back. So I went to Roach and go, hey, word on the street is I could buy my computer back. And he goes, okay, fine, I'll see what I can do. Roach returns to me and says, okay, just give me this amount of money and then I'll get your computer. And so then I call the police and I say, hey, word on the street is the Eagle has landed. I could get my computer back. What do we do now? And we set up the deal, and the police said, oh, sorry, the wire technician is on vacation, and we can't wire you up on the date you scheduled with Roach. And so I was like, no wonder nobody calls the police because they're really ineffective and useless and not there when you need them. And so I'm whining to the police, and the police said, well, if you're going to be so whiny, just go buy back your computer if you need it so badly. And I go, okay, fine. So I'm thinking, I've got this deal set with Roach. I get all that cash that he wanted. But then I realized that's sort of dumb to go out at night with all this cash to meet a guy named Roach. He could rob me, right? So I'm getting a little bit more street smart. So I tell my Cambodian friends who lived on the second floor, can you watch me to make sure I don't get robbed when I'm making my deal with Roach? And they said, sure. So now the time is set. I'm about to meet Roach. I have my cash. I'm going to buy my computer back. I have my Cambodian friends ready to watch me. They all have guns because everybody in my neighborhood had to have guns. And then so I go out, and then the Cambodian guys come out with me. And something got lost in the translation where I wanted them to watch from the window, but they came out with me. So if you ever see these movies where a person walks out and he has his gang slowly walking behind him in slow motion, that's how we looked. We were like Michael Jackson and Beat It or something. We were just slowly walking out. Meanwhile, all the kids in the complex were going, hey, Russell, what are you doing? And I'm saying, get away. Word on the street says the Eagles landed. I'm going to make my deal with Roach. And so they finally get away. I finally meet Roach. He's leaning against the car. I go, okay, here's my cash. And he tells me, oh, sorry, your computer has already been sold off. And that's the end of the story. So I didn't have a happy ending. I lost my computer, and that was it. But
did he
later,
take your money? Did he take your money?
No, he didn't take my money. No, but later I realized, wow, even though I lost my computer and nothing really happened out of this long story, I really, even though I lost my research on my work, I gained again something that I was invaluable. I had the support of all my neighbors, where I got the support of the word on the street from the manager, where Roach was willing to deal with drug dealers for me, where my Cambodian neighbors would actually bring out guns to protect me. right? And so I don't know if your neighbors in Orinda would do that for you, but all my neighbors went to great lengths, just to support the stupid person who leaves his computer available to get stolen. So another time, my car got broken into, and I'm going out at night, and I'm cleaning up all the glass, and my Cambodian neighbor comes out to help me again. And I'm really thanking him profusely. And he said, "That's okay, we're all in this together." And I think that's the sense that I felt, that we were all in this neighborhood together, that we all had each other's back, that we all had need of each other. And that's how Christians should be, that we're all sinners in need of Jesus's grace together. We're all broken people needing salvation together. We're all lost people being found together. And that connectedness, that support that I felt, the real concrete, it's not just like this emotional support, but it was real physical support that I received from my neighbors, really made me feel supported and loved there. So that's the type of community we had, where a Chinese American graduate student would get the support of drug dealers and convicted felons and Cambodian refugees and housing managers. And then you asked me about the lawsuit. So I'm there for like 7 years. Over time, our neighbors got to know, okay, Russell's more middle class, more educated, and his friends, his other Christian friends, are also resources. They asked us to start a tutoring program. They asked us to teach them English. And so we started all these programs in our neighborhood at the request of our neighbors. So it's very, from the grassroots. It's not like we came in and said, you need this stuff. They asked for this stuff. And so we got to know our neighbors really well through these interactions. Then there were a couple of issues that weren't just direct services like tutoring and ESL, but our kids were getting racially profiled by the police and having their pictures taken by the police as gang members. And that would lead them to have higher punishments if they were ever arrested. For the parents, that's really alarming because they went to the killing fields in Cambodia, and at the killing fields, they took pictures of people before they killed them. And so it was resurrecting trauma from the war, and then it was scary to have the police keep records of your innocent kids. So we organized and we had petitions, and we actually had the police come into our complex, and they promised to get rid of those letters. And so the parents recognized, wow, if we work together, we could get justice. The same thing came when welfare reform hit. A lot of the families who were refugees needed government assistance. They couldn't work because of the post-traumatic stress, because of language barriers, because they were too old. And so they needed welfare. They weren't going to get it because they weren't citizens. And so we organized, and we went to Sacramento. We were in the news with New York Times. And so we organized. So over time, we began to work with them on justice issues, not just compassion issues like tutoring. And what happened was that during one El Nino year, our apartment became flooded because of the strong rains. And everybody on the second floor, their roofs would leak, and they would actually get, their entire carpet soaked. And one grandma actually had a 30-gallon garbage can in the middle of her living room, and she funneled all the water coming in using garbage can bags. And she would fill that up, like, in a night. I went into another place. I stepped in and I walked into this mound of maggots. They had maggots growing in the carpet. You know how disgusting it's like? Ugh. And I was, you take off your shoes when you go into people's homes, and so we had maggots, we had roaches, people's sewers were backing up. And so everybody had really bad living conditions because of the rains. Because of the rains and because of our infestation, a lot of kids got asthma. And 6 families had to send their kids to the emergency room that winter because of asthma attacks. And so that's a case of environmental racism. It's not individual families who were sick, but the living conditions were making people sick. And it's racism because the landlord knew that these were immigrants who wouldn't complain, and he was charging them high rents, and he wasn't fixing up the place. So it was not benign negligence. It was actually willful negligence against people who wouldn't complain. So that's environmental and racism. So we decided to sue, that the way to address the housing conditions was to sue. And we got an attorney, and they said, if you sue, then the building will probably be built up, he'll probably fix the code, and then you could settle. That's all we wanted, to bring the building up to code compliance. Our landlord, though, was so evil that he decided, no, I'm not going to do anything. And he was going to fight the law. He just ignored the lawsuit. So we then brought in the city. The city began to fine the landlord for all these code violations. We brought in the press to show how bad it was. We organized, and even then, even though we were named one of the top 12 slums in Oakland, even though the city began to fine the landlord daily, he did nothing. Eventually, he declared corporate bankruptcy, that he wasn't personally liable, but Oak Park Apartments, a corporation, is now bankrupt, and he wasn't going to pay out or fix up the place. At that point, the city had condemned the building. So now we're living in a condemned building because the conditions were so bad. But they said we didn't have to move, but they weren't going to allow anybody new move into vacant places. The vacant places a lot of times would be used by drug users because they would use them up as shooting galleries because everything was left open. So now we have drug dealing in our apartment complex. We would find needles everywhere. We're living in a condemned building. The landlords declared corporate bankruptcy, and we felt like, wow, we really sort of screwed up the community. Everybody has to leave. So we Christians who sort of started the lawsuit, we felt like we led them on the wrong path. And that began our summer of prayer, because we really needed to rely on God, both to help deliver the people from being evicted and to pray for our hearts as Christians, because we were really angry and upset about the landlord and really hateful towards him, right? And so that bitterness and resentment was in our hearts. Eventually what happened was that a miracle came through. The three entities who were creditors to the landlord, the tenants who were suing him, the city who was fining him, and the bank that wasn't getting mortgage payments, we all worked together and went to bankruptcy court and said, if he wasn't going to pay, we're going to take away the property. Usually creditors fight over each other, right? They're fighting over the small piece of pie, but we actually worked together. And the city attorneys who worked with us was named Johnny Angel. So it was just really a miracle that we actually were able to first work together and then call him. When we said we were going to take away the property, the landlord finally came to meet with us and agreed to settle. And we won, and we won the settlement. We won $1 million in damages for all 52 households. And more importantly, we got the landlord to sell to a nonprofit. And that nonprofit got city funding, and it got totally rebuilt. So now we have new Oak Park, whereas once we were living in crowded one-bedroom housing that was infested. Families of 9 got 4-bedroom apartments that were clean, solar panels, ambient heating. We got a tenant center with a community garden, basketball courts. It was a lot better. So I would go around saying, oh, God's justice was achieved. We won, happy ending, because that's what Americans like, right? It's like, woohoo, God brought justice. But then, like you said, sadly, over time with new management, the new management was a little bit more strict in regulating tenant behavior. We used to have all these parties, and we used to, people would gamble, people would hang out, and instead the new management would sort of clamp down on a lot of the partying and activities of the people. And so what happened was that because of the more strict management and because people had the American dream, which was their own big homes, they retreated into their own homes. So rather than interacting a lot and having this lively, vibrant neighborhood where kids would play together and families would cook together and we would go in each other's homes, people just retreated into their own bedrooms and just played video games or watched, sang karaoke by themselves. And so sadly, what once was a really interactive, tight community became sort of this dead suburban place. And a lot of us from Oak Park sort of rue, the loss of that sense of community. We're sort of nostalgic of the way things used to be before the lawsuit. So it just shows that, God's justice could be secured. God does work, but things do change over time, and we got to keep on fighting for justice, because with this pandemic now and with the hardships people are facing, there's a lot more things in our neighborhood that we have to deal with. Our neighborhood actually has the highest rates of COVID-19 in Alameda County, 4 times the rate in the county, twice the rate of Oakland, because we have a lot of immigrants here.
I heard you in another interview, and you mentioned in the apartment complex, there was a gentleman there who was a shaman, a healer.
Yeah.
And you said from him, you learn new perspectives on social justice, racial justice from sort of an Asian perspective, which really struck me. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what was it that you learned from him about social justice, racial justice?
Yeah. So in our complex, there was a healer, and a lot of the Cambodians went to him whenever they had health or mental health issues, and he would work with spirits to address those issues. And so, in America, when we think of justice, we think of securing our rights. Like, we had the right to decent housing, and so we're going to fight for them. Or we think that we as individuals should be equal to everybody else. And that's our sense of justice, is to be equal to everybody else, to have equal rights, to have our rights defended. And so I went to the healer, his name was Beck Chom, and asked him, why did you join the lawsuit? Because a lot of Cambodians were afraid to complain to the government because of the killing fields, they were afraid that the government would be more oppressive. And, a lot of the Latinos, they wanted to fight for their rights that they had. And a lot of the young people understood their notion of rights. And so I asked Beck Chom, did you sign up for the lawsuit to get your rights, to protect your housing, to get money due to you? And he looked at me and he laughed. And he goes, I did it for you. What are you talking about? He said, I saw you going door to door and, asking everybody for help, that I did it to help you. And I go, well, that's sort of nice. What he did as an elder was that he didn't really care about fighting for his rights, but he cared about taking care and responding as an elder for the younger people in his community, like me. So he wanted to support me as a younger person. And that's the Asian notion of corporate responsibility, that we take care of each other, that he saw me needing help, and so he decided to help me. He was like a grandfather, clearly supporting his grandson or his son. And for me, that became the notion of justice, not about individual rights, but about taking corporate responsibility for one another. So justice is about making sure that everybody's health and housing are safe and secure, that we're all corporately, mutually responsible for each other. That's justice. And injustice occurs when we're not responsible for each other, when we're not taking care of each other. When the landlord doesn't provide housing, he's being irresponsible. When we're not fighting for the housing of our younger people, that's being irresponsible as an elder. So for me, that notion of justice got transformed from Beck Chom, from defense of rights to a notion of corporate responsibility. And actually, I think that's a much more biblical way of understanding justice, right? It's being in right relationships with each other. It's not about your own rights. It's about being in right relationship where you're taking care of one another. And so that's just one way he taught me that the Asian way of understanding scriptures, the Asian way of understanding justice, the Asian way of even understanding who Jesus was, is different and than a lot of what we get in mainstream America churches. And we need both perspectives to get the full depth of God's love and grace.
I love that sense of connection, relationship, and the collective body. Kind of reminds me of growing up in Hawaii. I mean, that's what it feels like, you know. So
It's
I know
family, right? It's being family.
it's all about family. Yeah.
So like now when it rains, I don't think about, oh, what a pain. I think about my neighbors who are unhoused living in the rain, right? And because I know them, because I see them so often, because they're sort of like my family, that's the first thing I think about. It's like, how are my family members doing in the rain, right? And so it just sort of shifts my perspective that think about others, think about your community, think of the least of these in your neighborhood. And, you know, I don't think I would have had that sense of empathy or that sense of solidarity unless I lived in this neighborhood and connected with people. And so that sense of justice comes from having family members who are living under unjust situations.
You know, recently, I know that you collaborated with several other Asian American organizations to form an online reporting site, Stop AAPI Hate. And also this summer you had a group of youth interns, and they surveyed Asian American youth across the country with regard to how this COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated racist and bigoted attitudes toward Asian Americans. So would you speak more to that now? But what's happening in Asian American and Pacific Islander communities when it comes to racist attitudes, you know, toward them?
Yeah. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, Asian Americans are experiencing a pandemic of racism as well. So we have multiple stressors. We're afraid of getting COVID-19 because we're family oriented. We're worried about our elders getting COVID-19. Because of racism, we've been harassed and attacked so much. People are really afraid and anxious and fearful of racial bias at the moment. And because of that racial bias, a lot of our businesses have met with disproportionate economic downturns. Asian Americans have higher rates of unemployment. We're also worried about our economic livelihood. So racism has led to an economic downturn in the Asian American community. So those four factors have led to a lot of anxiety and fear and stress in the Asian American community at this moment. We created this reporting site and in mid-March, and immediately we were flooded with reports of Asians getting harassed, yelled at. My own wife was coughed at while running. Someone actually blocked her way and coughed on her. And so a recent survey, a really good survey, said 6% of Asians in California have experienced direct racism during COVID-19. 6%, that doesn't sound like much, but there's so many Asians in California, that's over 300,000 people. So 300,000 people over 6 months means 50,000 incidents a month, right? And that's what, 1,500 incidents a day of racism against Asian Americans just in California. So it's widespread, it's pervasive. And you know, they're not microaggressions. People are like hurling racial epithets and slurs. People are yelling profanities, and they're attacking the most vulnerable in our community. Women get harassed 2.5 times more than men. Elderly report 1 out of 9 times. And you don't think of Asian seniors going online to complain, but they are because they're being mistreated. And our youth are also attacked in their schools and online. So it is a justice issue because people are telling us to get out of here. They go, you effing chink, go, why don't you go back home? Why did you bring the virus? Yeah.
That happened to me, unfortunately.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was sharing this with our congregation. Then I was getting some food at a local drive-through, and some guy saw me. He was at the driveway, the entrance of the driveway, and as soon as he saw me in my car, he just started yelling and screaming everything at me, and it was really disconcerting. But I mean, I wasn't fearful necessarily, but I was really surprised, and I have shared in a devotion to our congregation that, you know, I do walk a lot,
Mhm.
And but these days, I try to walk on the main street on the sidewalk as opposed to the trail behind me, because I feel like there are too many more people on the trail, and so there may be more opportunities for people to be uh, bigoted toward me. And
Yeah.
fortunately, it hasn't happened since then. But still, the thing is, I already feel this sense of fear and anxiety when I go out. And I'm in Walnut Creek. It's it's shouldn't be like that, but unfortunately, other people have told me that they've experienced the same thing. So it is
Yeah.
really troubling.
Yeah. Sorry you had to go through that. Like
Yeah,
that's the impact of harassment, is that, and women deal with this a lot, is it affects your behavior, right? So you avoid certain places at, and you avoid certain times of going out, and so you don't feel safe, and that lack of safety doesn't give you any freedom that Americans are supposed to have, right? And that's
yeah,
the danger of racism. So actually, Asian Americans who experience these types of incidents have a lot higher rates of anxiety and depression now. So it's documented that we have this general anxiety, but when you experience racism, that leads to 100% more um, rates of depression, anxiety, and somatic symptoms. So it's impacting our mental health and our health. So it's serious, you know.
yeah. So I have one more question. I'm actually going to merge two questions together. Uh, Amanda Young, who was one of your interns this summer, she's also one of our youth here at the church, and she and I were talking, and she asked me to ask you this question. So I'll ask you part of her question, and then also the second part, which is more kind of a suggestion to us as a congregation. So she asked, how are the experiences of Asian Americans similar to or different from the treatment of other racial ethnic groups in America? And also, how can people of all races and backgrounds stand in solidarity with one another? And with that question, I'd also like to ask you to share with us as a congregation, how can we be more aware in being able to stand with other communities?
Yeah. Well, LOPC should be very proud to have raised youth like Amanda who have values and characters that I think are really Christ-like. So congratulations, and hi, Amanda. It's a really good question. Asian Americans, like a lot of racial groups, are not have this conditional status in the United States. Sometimes we belong, but a lot of times we're deemed as not really American, asked, where are you from? And during COVID-19, we're told to go back to where you came from. We're told, actually policies now ban us from coming in further numbers. So we have an immigration ban now. There's a ban now of WeChat, so we can't even communicate with people in China anymore. There's a ban on international students. So the treatment that we're experiencing as Asians is that of unwanted outsiders. We're perpetual foreigners who don't belong in the United States. And sometimes we're allowed to get in as a model minority and accepted when we're crazy rich Asians, but now we're crazy infected Asians and we have to stay away. In fact, people spray us with Lysol because they think not only are we infected, we are the virus, right? There's numerous cases of people spraying us. It's so, it's unbelievable. So in that way, like other racial groups, I've heard other racial groups, like especially Latinx communities, told to go back. We're building a wall against them. And so, and even African Americans are told to go back to Africa. And it's like, we didn't even want to come here voluntarily in the first place, but now you're telling us to go back. And in that way, we face similar experiences. It's systematic in that it's not just individual prejudices, but policies are being enacted to mass detain minorities, to mass ban communities like Muslims and Asians now, to mass incarcerate communities. So like other minorities, we're facing policies enacted against us as the other. We're also met with interpersonal violence, so we're being racially profiled. Whites may be seen as individuals, and you treat them as individuals. But when you see an Asian, you lump them with other Asians, and you may mistake them with others. That's why, people are really blaming China for COVID-19, but it's not only Chinese who are being attacked right now. It's anybody who looks Chinese. So 60% of our cases come from East Asians who look Chinese, like Gerald, or Pastor Gerald, or people who are Vietnamese or Korean. One Latino person was told to go back to China because they look Chinese. An indigenous person in Africa and Vancouver was punched and told to go back to China. So people see us, they racially profile us, they blame us. And so that act of racial profiling with people's automatic assumptions about who we are, that's a common racial experience. And so I think because we face systemic oppression, because we're met with interpersonal violence, because we're being racially profiled and stereotyped, those are ways that we have this sort of solidarity as people of color. So Asian Americans now are the racial group most supportive of Black Lives Matter. In Amanda's internship, they found that Asian American youth are really angry at this moment, that the predominant feeling of 80% of Asian American youth is anger, because they know that the system is working against African Americans and the system is wanting Asian Americans out. And so again, you don't think of Asian Americans as being an angry people, but they are, because they're facing so much injustice. Anger is actually a natural response to injustice when things aren't right? Anger is actually righteous when things are not right. And that's how we're feeling. And that's why we're in so much solidarity with Black Lives Matter and in fighting for anti-Asian hate.
That is so great to hear, because most of my work in the past has been with predominantly Asian American churches. And while there are always some who were quite engaged and involved in racial justice issues, primarily I think we were in the background. And I think it comes from the idea that we're always invisible anyway. And so we're not that engaged. But I'm so glad to hear that there's much more awareness today among our Asian youth and among youth in general.
All right.
I think even talking with my son, who's going to be 24 soon, I'm really happy and just overjoyed that he's becoming more aware himself, and he talks to me about things that are happening in the world. So
well, again, yeah, it's not just youth. Senior citizens are reporting to us, right? And so that just shows they're not this quiet traditional people. When you experience racism, you want to speak out. And so we're getting reports from, again, 1 out of 9 elderly people. 1 out of 9 our respondents are elderly. We're getting a lot of reports from people who don't even speak English. So you think of immigrants as not complaining, as being quiet, but people recognize when people are mistreating them. People recognize racism. It's not like that hard of a concept that people are singling you out and cursing at you. So a lot of our reports come from people reporting in Korean, reporting in Vietnamese, reporting in Hmong. And so, yeah, this racism is pretty blatant these days.
I'm glad to hear that people aren't afraid now to speak up. So finally, would there be a word that you would like to share with our congregation as far as how we might continue to become more involved, more engaged, more knowledgeable about issues of race and justice?
Yeah, I often don't know what to tell a suburban church about justice, because it seems like, oh, they're sort of removed from a lot of the issues, and they don't know anybody facing particular injustices. But I think pray for a heart of compassion and empathy and justice, which is what God calls us to do in Micah, right? To be humble and to really long for things to be made right in this world. So I guess, first of all, for our own sanctification, to have hearts the way of God's heart, of what he wants. And if we don't have those hearts of compassion and justice and humility, then maybe we should be repentant for not having that more. And so both lamenting and longing and praying for God's justice and compassion, both in our own hearts and in our nation, I think is what God would want at this moment. When it's so easy to see the injustices and brokenness. Secondly, I think I'm really burdened by the polarization of the church, that we think that we know what's right as compared to the other side who think they know what's right. And we seem to follow political ideologies more than Christian principles. And so I pray, like Jesus's disciples, they came from extreme opposite political ends. You had Simeon the Zealot fighting for Jewish independence, and you had Matthew the tax collector, who is representing the Roman Empire colonizing the Jews. Yet they came together, and I think that's the power of the Holy Spirit. And I want the church to represent and reflect that unity, and it's not now. And so actually, I think it really burdens me to see that the church's witness to the world is so poor. And so you could pray for the church that we could be Christ-like in our sense of unity and love, both across racial lines and across political lines. I think it's actually easier to be racially reconciled than it is to be politically reconciled at this moment, And I guess my words for LOPC is, it's a hard journey to pursue justice, but it's a lifelong thing that's the right thing to do. So even though you never see fully justice, just like you may never fully see God's kingdom come, it becomes a daily prayer and act, right? To live out God's kingdom to come. And I think however you think, or however you long for God's kingdom to come, we should be living that out. Not just because it'll actually come right now, but because it's our hope and our faith and our trust in God who is good.
Well, that's a great word to end on today. And so thank you so much, Dr. Russell Jeung, and we are grateful that you spent this time with us today, and blessings to you and all the work that you're doing. And
Okay, thank you.
To our listening audience, aloha and mahalo, and we'll see you again next time.